My name is Brenna O'Brien. Be happy to hear from you on Twitter during or after my talk. I'll tweet out my slides there as well. I am a front-end engineer at TED, and I came all the way from Toronto in Canada to be here. So let's get right to it. When you think of the term real developer, what goes through your head? How would you describe that? Maybe it's technical skills, maybe it's a certain framework, maybe it's work ethic. But I think there's probably a common thread that many of you have said to yourselves at one time, and that's, I'm not a real developer. A real developer is not me. And I think that happens quite a bit. What's happened is we've built up this image in our heads, this kind of false expectation of what it actually takes to be a real developer, to be a success in this industry. And it looks a little something like this. But like I said, it's just not realistic. We're going to be constantly striving for something we're never going to actually be able to achieve. And we're just always going to be disappointed in ourselves if we keep sticking to that. So today, what I want to do is talk about a slightly more realistic concept of what it means to be a real developer. It's not going to be quite as glamorous as maybe the image that you had in your head, but it's going to get the job just done like just fine, and it's going to be pretty fun still. So the first myth I'd like to address is the feeling like I, as a developer, need to know everything. So maybe some of you saw this from a Medium article recently of the front-end spectrum. And this is sort of what we feel like we need to know, that we need to know all of this. It is a really awesome, exciting time to be a JavaScript developer and be part of front-end development because there's so much innovation happening and a lot of really good stuff happening in our field and moving it forward. But it can also be an incredibly overwhelming time, just feeling like you have to keep up with everything. But oftentimes, these are like competing tools, competing standards, and to know all of them really isn't practical. You end up spreading your resources, your knowledge, your efforts too thin, and you would end up just not really knowing any tool, any framework in particular super well. So it's OK to not know everything and to find your niche as things get more increasingly complicated. It's OK to kind of narrow your focus to one piece of that pie. Now, something that I think we can all do each other a favor with here is stop tool and technique shaming someone who doesn't use the same thing as you and who doesn't use the newest version of something. How often have you heard a statement like this? You still use Gulp? Oh my gosh, you should be using Webpack by now. Insert a different name, a newer framework. It goes on over and over and over again. But when we look at just, for example, the state of, say, front-end build tools, if we look at this timeline, we see Grunt came out in early 2012, and then within a year, there were 3 other competing standards, and these are just kind of the major ones that I picked out. There's even more on this list. And so while it's tempting to say, oh my god, a new and shiny thing that I have to use, compare this timeline with your typical project lifecycle, and also think about everyone who's maintaining legacy code. It's simply not practical, and I think a few of you touched on this in the panel yesterday, is that you can't just go ripping out your build tool or your framework and replacing it in an actual work project. That's just not gonna happen. There's huge costs involved to doing that, and the timelines just don't match up. So instead of reaching for something new and shiny just because it's new and shiny, use it when it actually solves a specific problem. If you've noticed that your Grunt build times are really slow, maybe then it's time to start looking into Gulp. But if Grunt is working totally fine for you, there's no reason to go ripping it out just because something jazz hands shiny came along. There's also another more subtle form of this feel like we need to know everything, and that's the feeling like we need to memorize everything. And I see this one especially a lot with beginners. I taught at a front-end development bootcamp for a year. Richard Feynman has a great story about when he was attending graduate school in physics. And he decided that he wanted to sit in on biology lectures. The professor let him on the condition that he did the assignments and the presentations. He was presenting in this biology class, and he started out with a diagram of the body parts of a cat. And all the biology students kind of gave him a funny look and judged him and said, "Why are you wasting your time showing us something that we already know?" To which he replied, "No wonder I can catch up with you in a month in what you've learned in 4 years." They had wasted their time memorizing stuff like that when it could be looked up in 15 minutes. This is so true of the work that we do as well. Trivia on syntax and how a programming language works isn't really what's going to make you a successful developer. And we live in the luxury of the internet, where it takes us even faster than 15 minutes. It's probably more like 15 seconds. So I want us to remember that this is not a test. I know this one is hard to break because most of us in our schooling have been brought up with a culture of memorization where the way that we succeed is by memorizing information and then spitting it back. But it's a habit that I think we need to break as developers. And just realize that it's OK to look it up. We see this in like whiteboard interviews and things like this too. That's not, to me, the measure of a real programmer, someone who can remember things unnecessarily. Any memorization that I've done has come simply from repeated use. And there are things like the difference between splice and slice that I still look up on a daily basis, even though I've been writing JavaScript for several years. So instead of feeling like we need to know everything, I'm going to bust that myth with a more reasonable alternative that real developers just know how to use their resources wisely. They know where to look for good documentation. They know how to structure their queries on Google properly. They know that there is a wealth of resources at their fingertips, and they use tools when they're appropriate for them. Now, something that goes hand in hand with this is if you're the maintainer of a tool or a library or a project, even something internal, as Alice mentioned, you need to write documentation for that. This is a famous Kathy Sierra quote. She says, "If you want them to RTFM, you better make a better FM." And that's very true. Just because you've written something about it, you shouldn't expect people to have to go searching through your shitty documentation and then blame them for not being able to understand it. Make a resource that they're going to be able to use and that they're going to want to use. Another important resource to remember that we all have is our peers. This one can be a little tricky because it involves a little human vulnerability in asking somebody else for help. But when I compare the work that I did learning when I was on my own and Googling and Stack Overflowing for answers, I learned at a much slower pace than when I was able to turn to somebody next to me or in a chat and say, "Hey, how would you go about doing this? What's your advice?" Jessica Rose sums this up nicely by saying, "My biggest professional development was getting comfortable admitting what I don't know." She goes on to say, "Yes, people will dismiss or judge you for this, but fuck them. Pretending to know what people were talking about didn't help me learn or grow as a technologist. The cost wasn't worth the savings to my pride." So I think it's important to remember that this is a big ecosystem. Remember that big pie. Just because you have to ask about another slice of the pie doesn't negate the part that you do know. It's OK to lean on each other, even though it takes a little courage to get up the comfortable admitting that you don't know something. Basically, we all just need to get over ourselves a bit. Get over our own egos. You're going to miss out on learning opportunities, and also the kind of people who aren't looking for help, aren't willing to work together, are not the kind of people that you're going to work productively with. I've interviewed a lot of front-end developers recently in my current job, and when I ask somebody a technical question, I'm perfectly OK, and I will give that person a thumbs up and a go-ahead if they tell me they don't know. I do not want to hire somebody who's going to bullshit their way through it, because that's how they're going to work on the job. I want somebody that's going to collaborate and be part of the team, and we'll all learn and grow together. And so I think this rule also just doesn't go for beginners. Dan Abramov and Ryan Florence, who are two big names in the React community, frequently use this hashtag #JuniorDevForLife. They are extremely established developers, but every time they have a question about something, they're not shy about showing it. And they use this hashtag to say that our journeys as developers are just continually learning. It's never done. We're all junior developers for life. So I think even if you're an expert in this industry and you feel confident in your knowledge, all of us can take a lesson in being more vulnerable and just sharing our struggles along the way. So the lesson here is that real developers accept the unknown. Instead of knowing everything and feeling like we have to know everything, we acknowledge what we don't know, and we acknowledge that it's not practical to know it all. Another myth I want to bust is the idea that we need to write perfect code all the time. When I used to teach, I saw a screen like this quite frequently. I'd have a student come to me, ask me for help, and say, is this the right way to do it? They'd have code in their head, but they'd be afraid to write it down if it wasn't the correct way. Now, of course, my advice to them was just try it out and see what happens. But this is kind of a hard habit to break for a lot of us, because a lot of us have grown up with the old adage, measure twice and cut once. And now this makes a lot of sense when you're dealing with a physical thing where your work can't be undone. If you're a sculptor or you're sewing clothing, like there's all these cases where you do want to be really careful and plan ahead of doing things, but that's just simply not the case when it comes to development. You sort of have unlimited retries. Pixels are free. You can keep doing things and trying them over. Basically, software is soft. Think of it like Play-Doh. You can sculpt something out of that, and then if it doesn't work out, if you didn't like it, mush it up and try again. Moria Carvares teaches underprivileged children with Scripted how to code. Now, these kids have a real reason to feel failure in their lives. Mistakes can actually be very costly for them. And so it's really hard for them to get over this idea of failing in their code, of writing code that's not perfect, that doesn't work. She uses the analogy of a video game. When we play a video game, we die along the way, but then we get back and we restart it and do it over and over again. I think this is a really healthy metaphor to keep in mind. With coding, we really just do keep trying. It's a journey along the way. Realize that failure isn't really detrimental when it comes to coding. Edison knew this way back, and he was dealing with physical media. He prototyped over like 10,000 light bulbs in his quest to invent the light bulb. And after one promising experiment went wrong, his assistant said, "Aren't you upset that you failed?" And he said, "No, I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work." And I think that's how we learn as developers. We go through and we find out what doesn't work, and that's how we learn what does work. We learn from our mistakes. It's absolutely part of the process. Part of that as well is knowing how to figure out how to fix your code when it does go wrong. Debugging is just as critical a skill as the building blocks of a language, but it's not something that gets taught, really. The great thing about computers, unlike a video game, is there's all these pointers that tell you exactly why things went wrong if you know where to look. But you have to learn your tool set to figure out exactly what's going to go, how you're going to fix it, and how you're going to investigate and narrow down how to fix that bug. And so again, we need to be accepting that your code is going to have bugs. You're going to spend a lot of time fixing them. So knowing how to make an intelligent search about where to go to fix that is a really, really critical skill. And now, I think we shouldn't keep that process to ourselves. It's really tempting to only put out your success, to only want to share the finished product online. But we can model to other people that it's OK to fail by showing our failures along the way. The things that we learn in our process are probably valuable as lessons to others, and you're probably going to be helping people out if you start putting more of your process and your problem solving out into the world with the code and the projects that you share, not just the solution. Ed Catmull is the president of Pixar. And he talks about how this idea of sharing work early on is really integral to their creative process and allows them to be creative and have a real true community as a team where together they can do any more than one individual person could creatively create. He says, don't wait for things to be perfect before you share them with others. Show early and show often. It'll be pretty when we get there, but it won't be pretty along the way. And so I think we can do this with things like opening a pull request when it's a work in progress, just to kind of get feedback early on. I've even been hesitant to do this. You don't want to show your code to anyone until you think it's like absolutely perfect. It's really hard to get over it, but we can help each other out so much and learn so much from each other if we do. And I think there's a really huge reason why a lot of us are afraid to do this, and that is the dreaded well, actually. How often have you seen this? Somebody puts out their code online, and just like within seconds, there's somebody there to point out the like little nitpicky thing that went wrong. Instead of celebrating what went right, we're going to point out what went wrong. How is somebody ever going to feel like they're succeeding if we're just pointing out their failures? And most of the time, a lot of the things that get pointed out come down to personal preference. We know in JavaScript that there are multiple ways to do the exact same thing. So use robots like linters or formal code reviews to actually enforce these stylistic preferences, not something like Twitter. We should be thanking and congratulating anyone who's brave enough to share their code with the world and put it up online. And so I think we need to, instead of just pointing out what's wrong, like I say, celebrate success. There's been scientific studies that say that teams that celebrate small wins through physical contacts like high fives and like chest bumps and stuff actually go on to win more games. Now, while it's not always possible to make these kind of like meaningful physical contacts with our online peers, I think we can go a long way by just giving like a thumbs up emoji or a high five virtually and just saying, hey, thanks, that's really great that you shared that. So my lesson here is, instead of being perfect, let's make sure that we encourage each other through all stages of the process and through sharing our work together. Another big myth that I want to bust is the feeling like I have to code all day and every day. This is extremely harmful, but an extremely prevalent narrative in our industry. Is feeling like you have to put in long hours or spend time outside work on open source projects or blogging. I hear this time and time and again, and I hear people really discouraged and feel like that, they're not hireable or they'll never make it in this industry if they're not doing things outside of their day-to-day jobs. I heard this firsthand with one of my strongest students from the boot camp. She did very well. She came out of it with a beautiful portfolio, and she got hired at a small agency right out of the boot camp. By all means, a success. A couple months into her job, though, she confided in me that she was not sure about continuing as a developer. She really missed doing things with her hands, and she was kind of interested in carpentry and woodworking. And she said, maybe I'll just quit dev and go into woodworking instead. And the fact that she saw that as a binary choice, that I could either be a developer or a carpenter, made me really sad. Nobody should be forced to choose between the work, the code they do, and the other facets of their life that they have that make them who they are. And spending all our time with code can be so, so limiting. Ellen Allman talks about Silicon Valley saying, they want to change the world, but they work all the time. So what exactly do they know about the world outside the cloisters of VCs and startup cultures? There's so much truth in this. The web and JavaScript especially are just touching every aspect of our lives, every industry now. So how can we expect to build things that serve the entire world if we're not representative of the entire world in our interests, in our hobbies, in our race, in our gender? We need to be not homogenous as an industry. We need to do things that are not code sometimes in order to build our perspective. Luckily, with my friend, I said, wait, hold on. It's OK. I know developers who are carpenters. I also know developers who are musicians, who love to cook. Matt Marquis, for example, Wilto on Twitter, he's done a ton of amazing work in the responsive images community. He did a lot of early pioneering work just with responsive design. Again, a very successful developer by anyone's standards. But he used to be a carpenter before he started doing development. And he continues to do that work on his own time in conjunction with being a developer. And I've even seen him give talks about how his work as a carpenter has influenced him in a positive way and changed his perspective on how he approaches development. Being a developer does not have to negate your hobbies. So go ahead and share those. Don't be shy about what you do outside of coding. Developers can also be parents. This is Nicole Sullivan's little boy, and she is Stubbornella on Twitter, and I encourage you to take a look at her feed because this is a new thing for her, having a baby, and it's completely changed her perspective on what it's like being a developer and also being a parent. She told me that she used to, in hiring, look at people's open source contributions as a hiring criteria, but she's reconsidered that now because she realizes that not everybody has the luxury of working on code outside of work. Some of us have other responsibilities, like kids, or we just like to do other things. You don't know somebody's personal story, and for us to require that somebody works really long hours or codes outside of their work time should not be a stipulation of this job. There's absolutely a place for those people who have passion and drive and require less sleep than some of us, but that shouldn't be the norm. That shouldn't be required. And not only is this not possible for some people, but it's unhealthy for most of us. There's been studies shown that after, I think, about 4 weeks of prolonged overtime, so a 60-hour crunch mode, for example, I think we all kind of have an intuition that you're maybe not super productive as usual, but your productivity actually goes negative after sustained overwork. Negative. You are doing your employers harm, yourselves harm by just narrowly focusing yourself and burning yourself out on just coding. So do yourselves a favor and take a mental break, do something else, even if it can still be something that you think about, but just try and get your head out of that space. So instead of just putting in more hours to do better work, let's focus on working with what we have. This is 37 Signals. They created Basecamp and a lot of really awesome products. And they talked about when they were building Basecamp how they had a really small team. They were geographically distributed across time zones. Some of their members had children. There were a lot of constraints for them to work with. But instead of complaining about that and trying to hire more people without the money, they just worked with what they have. And you come out with a better product in the end if you think creatively and are able to work within these constraints. They say constraints are often advantages in disguise. Forget about VC, long release cycles, and quick hires. Instead, work with what you have. You can do good things in a limited time, and you're just going to use your resources more wisely. So my lesson here is to think outside the browser as developers. Whether that be in another hobby, in just other facets of your life, it's OK to step away from the computer, keep your hobbies, make time for your friends and your families, and your work will be better for it in the end. So where I think this gets really interesting is when people are able to bring their hobbies and their interests back into the work they do. We also saw Mariko yesterday, or 2 days ago, was it? And she talked about how she put JavaScript and code on a knitting machine. I never dreamed that I would see that happen, but she did it, and it's really awesome, and it's incredibly inspiring work that I think could inspire people to pick up coding that maybe hadn't been, maybe other knitters out there. Jen Schiffer also runs a blog called vart.institute. She wanted to learn more about fine art, so she started recreating it in different code and learning about code and art at the same time. She also has a website called Make It 8-Bit Art, where you can draw 8-bit artwork. When we blend our code and our passions, really amazing things can happen. Amy Weibo of the Bubble Sort magazine, a zine about programming and computer science, summed this up really nicely. She tells us, technology-inspired technology gives us incremental improvements. Art-inspired technology, however, gives us brand new ideas. Again, thinking outside the browser can really help us to think in new ways and move our industry forward into new areas that we'd never thought of before. So my takeaway here is, you do you, everybody. Whether you're a new developer getting into the fields or an experienced developer, don't feel like you have to give up on your past life or your past self or the parts of you that aren't fitting the mold of being a developer. Go ahead and be yourself and share that with the world, either just by being candid about your life outside code on Twitter or a blog, or actually bringing that back into your projects in an interesting way. So to sum up, real developers don't have to know everything. They just have to be resourceful, using their tools appropriately, and asking peers for help. They don't need to be perfect. They just need to be accepting of failure and humble about their own abilities. And you don't have to be like everyone else. Use what makes you unique to enrich our industry and solve interesting problems in a creative way. So I encourage you all to take what you've learned here and go out there and just bust this myth. Bust this myth of the real developer that doesn't exist, and reshape the narrative of what it means to be a success and a real developer in this industry. Thanks.